platforms or algorithms make them out to be. So I'm usually based in Berlin. Of course, you all know the NetzDG, and what I'd like to talk to Jeremy about is how sort of there's a difference between the British online harms bill in regard to the NetzDG. So the German law has been criticized for sort of putting the onus completely on platforms to determine whether any given post is illegal online in the same way as it would be illegal offline. And interestingly, we've had a couple of court cases where judges, at least on the lower courts, failed to actually rule what was illegal content. So you might wonder how Facebook can do it if even German judges cannot. But in what way does your online harms bill differ from this approach of putting responsibility solely on the backs of platforms to set the boundaries?
Well, I think it goes back to the conversation we've been having about the way in which you expect a regulator to operate. And I think in terms of illegal content, and there is a distinction in what's likely to come out as UK legislation between illegal content and lawful but harmful content. And so far as illegal content is concerned, I think what we would want is the same thing as what we would want for lawful but harmful content, which is that there's an interactive conversation between a platform and its regulator. And that may sound like a terribly naive thing to say, but I do think it's possible. And I would say that actually, when it comes to broadcast media, print media, the regulation that happens of broadcast media in the UK is by Ofcom, who will be the regulator for online as well. And the interaction between Ofcom and, for example, broadcast media is pretty good. And there is an opportunity to say, if you are regulated, I am not sure what the appropriate response is to the thing that is in front of me. So I will go and speak to the regulator and I will say, what do you think? If I do X, would that be, in your view, the appropriate response? If I did Y, would that be an appropriate response? That kind of interaction is the kind of thing we should expect, I think, a sensible regulator to do with the organizations that it is regulating. And if, therefore, there is confusion, let's try and resolve that confusion by a discussion between regulator and regulated before it ever gets to an enforcement stage. I don't think, speaking as a criminal lawyer by background, that there is all too often very much confusion about what is criminal and what is not. I think the confusion comes, and the difficult part comes, when we're talking about lawful but harmful content. That is absolutely where definitions matter, and where legislators and regulators have to be very clear in their definitions so that everybody knows where they stand. There may be challenges in being able to identify individual pieces of, for example, unlawful child pornography content, but frankly, the concept of what is unlawful versus what is lawful is not, I think, where our problem lies in the UK. I mean, I think on the NetzDG laws, obviously, a lot of this has been about how quickly you expect platforms to take the content down and the consequences if they don't take it down quickly enough. So again, I think there's a lot of learning everybody can do from everyone else's experiences. And what I hope the UK government will do is look around the world at what has been done and make sure we learn the appropriate lessons from it. The UK approach is going to be quite different, though, to what's been tried elsewhere, because it is far more comprehensive. And I think you can only approach a comprehensive system of regulation effectively if you are giving some discretion to your regulator to act appropriate in each individual circumstance. So a bit of trust between regulator and regulated is going to be necessary.
There is criticism saying that by restricting your plans to regulate disinformation and misinformation in the way that it's sort of restricted to misinformation that causes significant harm to an individual, you're sort of exempting the disinformation that is damaging democracy. So if you take, for instance, spreading false rumors about election fraud, as we've seen in the US, this could, of course, undermine trust in a voting system. So would you say that's a shortcoming of the current bill?
Yes, I would. I think it is going to be necessary for us to look very carefully at whether or not the definitions of harm are too restrictive. I entirely understand the concern that the platforms will have legitimately, that if you're not clear about what it is they're supposed to do, they will find it very difficult to do it. I think that's a fair comment. But I also think that if you are too restrictive in the way in which you define harm, you will miss a large piece of what people are understandably concerned about. And disinformation is not just something that damages an individual. it can, as you say, damage a democracy, or democracy as a concept, and also damage groups of individuals. And I think if you are too restrictive in the way in which you define harm, you will simply end up missing a great deal of what this bill and this regulatory approach should cover. My answer, I have to say, to those who say, well, how are you going to make sure that this doesn't go too far, doesn't reach too widely, is to rely on my favorite word, reasonably, and to say that in the end, you have to recognize that certain things are unrealistic expectations of any platform, however hard it is trying. You cannot expect a platform to exclude every element of harmful content. And you could not expect, for example, the same of a very small platform as you could of a very large one. So all of these are discretions that I think regulators should be given. But I don't accept that defining down the way in which harm is described in the way that which the government, I think, currently intends to do in this bill is the right way to do it, because just as you say, we will miss some of the big harms that people are justifiably concerned about.
Well, let me just chime in here, because I think what Jeremy says is very interesting, and I think maybe we need to take a somewhat broader view of harms, particularly as it relates to disinformation. But I would say also, let's be mindful that even the regulators can abuse the idea of harm. I'll give you a concrete example. We all agree that totally false news is not a value we want to protect. But at least until last November or last January, we had a president of the United States who believed that any news that made him look bad was fake. And that if he had the power to regulate that, or if his assistants did, we would be living in a very different country. So one of the things I think we've learned looking around the world in the last few years is that the norms of behavior that we've come to expect from our government officials may not always be observed by some government officials. And so we need to build a rule that is both comprehensive enough, but also has guardrails against abuse by people who are not sharing our norms.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think two things are important about regulators. One, they have to be independent. That means independent of everybody in the political spectrum. Two, they have to be appealable. There has to be a way of challenging the decision a regulator makes, just in case the regulator's got it wrong. Now, these are all delicate balances, and we have to, as I say, as legislators, we have to set out the legislative framework within which a regulator operates. But in the end, a regulator's judgment has to be preserved as independent to avoid just what you're describing. But we also have to account for the fact that mistakes could be made and they need to be corrected. So some form of appeal mechanism is also essential.
John, I think you wanted to comment.
Yeah, I listening to this, I can't help but recall that I don't think in the United States I've ever met a person, left or right, who didn't believe not only that those who opposed them were mistaken or got the facts wrong, but were actually just lying about it, right? This was an early lesson I learned at the Cato Institute. So that and the whole other side of this, which I think perhaps is more American than European, the problem of public choice, the problem of government not pursuing the welfare, general welfare, but pursuing a more partisan or narrow. And you certainly do have to have protections against that. And the United States Supreme Court is one, and it does it by having a very broad notion of incitement. And I might also say, telling falsehoods is not protected by the First Amendment.
Damien, would you like, as you're sort of an expert on both the European and UK approach to things, and of course I'm looking at the US as well, would you like to comment?
Well, just listening to the comments that were made, I think we have to recognise that in terms of like incitement, social media creates a new sort of a problem, because in the Supreme Court Brandenburg case, there's a case of a man said something that was recorded by a television camera that may have caused a credible, imminent risk to illegal activity taking place. With social media, it could well be that trying to look for an individual post that has done that is maybe the wrong thing to look at. Saying, what is the effect of a constant drumbeat of the reassertion of a mistruth or something harmful, something that may incite people to behave in a discriminatory or prejudiced way against other people, what is the consequence of that over a long period of time, over many months or even many years? What is the role of social media in the rise we're seeing in the Western world in levels of self-harm amongst young girls, of race-motivated crimes, and increasing levels of hate speech? We've seen a really interesting demonstration this year of the power of social media to help shape views around the coronavirus and its vaccine and its causes. In something new that's come along that's not a party political issue. It's not about left or right. It's just about people trying to access information and their ability to be influenced by what they see. This is a different sort of a problem, and that's why I certainly feel that the sort of regulatory approach that I think in the UK we're trying to set out through the Online Safety Bill, similar to the EU's Digital Services Act as well, is to say we need institutions that can take a balanced view, that can actually say, are the systems of these companies being used to make harm worse, to spread harm? Is that influencing people's actions and behaviours, and is it responsible? In the same way, in most other industries, we seek to regulate business practices, and I don't think we should lose sight of the fact that that's principally what we're talking about. That we're not talking about seeking to regulate citizen speech. We're talking about the need to regulate business practices that are there and have been designed to make money for the companies that operate them. Facebook has a business model around engagement. It directs content at people. It thinks that it will engage them, and it makes money out of that by holding their attention and selling ads against it. And so I'm very sympathetic to what people like Bruce Reed, the new White House Deputy Chief of Staff, said. If it's something a company's making money out of, it's something that company could be regulated for. And I think John's comment earlier on as well about the editorial function that social media companies play in selecting, ranking, boosting content, I think is absolutely right. And for me, although this is about American law, it sits ill with Section 230 and the idea that platforms are neutral. That they are merely the conduit of other people's content. They clearly influence the way that content is distributed and shared, and who sees it and how frequently. And therefore, I think that's a legitimate area for regulation. And whilst I don't, with the Facebook Oversight Board, although I think it's right that the people should question the editorial decisions that Facebook make on individual bits of content, we don't yet have a system that allows us to regulate the systems or even understand how they work. So
Thank you, Damien. I think we've got about a minute and a half left, and I'd just like to hear from Werner, who didn't have as much speech time as many others in this round, to hear his very brief thoughts on how the EU is going forward, looking at what the UK is doing, looking at what the US is doing, and regarding to what Jeremy said earlier, that you can't wait sort of for a global system to work. Is the EU going to sort of take on shared best practices by the UK, for instance, or the US? Brief answer, please.
Yeah, well, I think we have been looking into all these systems all the time. The DSA didn't fall from the sky, but we have been working for years and consulting widely and so on. So I think we have tried to take in all the good elements that we could find. I think what is important really going forward is to distinguish between the individual and how you protect the individual whose content may be affected, right? Werner Stenk uploads something, Facebook takes it down, or Twitter. How will I be informed? How can I react? How can I complain? And then the other debate is really how do we dealing with the risks to democracy, more widely speaking? What systems check do we have in place? What transparency do we need? What accountability mechanisms do we need for platforms really to demonstrate to us that they do take measures to reduce any systemic risk that they may be posing to society? And I think these are the things that I think both of us on both sides of the Atlantic would share, that we may not always totally agree on every comma, but I think that is the direction of travel where we should be able to agree.
Wonderful, Benna. Thank you very much. Brilliant last words. Thank you all in alphabetical order: Damien, Jeremy, John, and Werner. I'll now hand over to our next session, and Jean. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts. I think we've all come a step closer in the strive to tackle all these challenges we have to address. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I'm sorry to say we had some problem with transmission with that last session. So if your viewing was interrupted, I want to reassure you we will be posting the entire session on all of our platforms. We hope that you'll take advantage of that and watch what was a great conversation. And now let me introduce our final guest. Anders Fogh Rasmussen is, of course, the chairman of the Alliance of Democracies Foundation. He's with us, as is Eric Schmidt. Eric Schmidt is the former CEO of Google, and he also was chairman of the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence, which recently released its final report. Over this last day and a half, we have spent a lot of time talking about the interplay between technology and democracy. A lot of our conversation has dwelled on social media. Artificial intelligence is part of that conversation, but it is also a lot more. We're going to dig into that in just a moment. But first, Anders, I wondered if you want to sum up what's been said so far at the Copenhagen Democracy Summit about technology and democracy.
I think there is a widespread agreement that technology is essential when it comes to democracy. Technology is neither good nor bad. It's an instrument, and it's very much dependent on how you use technology. You can use technology to promote freedom and democracy, and you can use technology to suppress freedom and democracy. And it's our task to make sure that new technology, be it information and communication technology or artificial intelligence, that new technology is really used to promote freedom and democracy. I think this is the main conclusion from our deliberations in Copenhagen.
Eric Schmidt, as I mentioned, the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence has issued its final report, and it was something of a call to arms, saying that the U.S. at least is not prepared to defend or compete when it comes to artificial intelligence. Tell us, first of all, why this is so important.
Well, first, thank you, Jeannie, for hosting this. And I'd like to thank the Prime Minister, who's been somebody I've known for a long time, for participating in this with me. 2 years ago, the Congress asked a group, of which I was elected the head, to try to figure out what was going to happen in the global geopolitical system with AI, and in particular with the focus of national security for the United States. We've produced a very, very thorough analysis of where the technology is and where the countries are. And our headline is that this is going to be the big competition over the next 5 or 10 years, and that the United States is not ready for it. I would say further, I am quite convinced that Europe is not ready for it, and I can tell you why. But this competition is crucial because AI will become part of the fabric of all of the leading industries for the next essentially 10 to 20 years. China has a policy in this area, which they publicized, and they're investing heavily. The West does not have a policy. We propose one for the West.
China has said that it's going to be number one in AI by 2030. Are they going to succeed?
Well, a lot depends on what we do now. We looked at the question of whether the West is ahead of China and how far ahead. And we concluded that the United States is somewhat ahead of China. And we used a set of metrics, including research papers, investment, and so forth. But we conclude that China will catch up very quickly. The great battle in AI, people think of it as data, and data is very important, and China has a lot of it. But the real battle in AI is talent. And what we talk about is the importance of talent in the United States, and in particular pro-immigration, to try to get that talent globally to work on these problems. Put another way about AI, AI will ultimately transform our society in ways which are very hard to describe and very, very big. And we're just at the first steps of that. We still don't, for example, understand exactly how the algorithms work. They can't explain themselves. Put another way, it's an intelligence that cannot tell you why it did something. And there are also all sorts of problems, biases, data problems, and these sorts of things, which researchers are working on. So we call for a number of things, a lot of recruiting of talent, a lot of changes in United States policy, the building of partnerships with Western democracies. This is particularly focused on the leading countries of Europe and the place where the technology is, and a tremendous amount of investment in research and development in these areas.
I want to talk a lot more about that international cooperation, but first I'd like to, if you could, to draw a clearer picture of what's at stake. Your report calls this, I believe, the ultimate dual-use technology. It can obviously be used to great benefit in many ways, but explain to us why democracies could be concerned about how AI could be weaponized against them.
Well, let's start with the prejudice that I had for a long time. As most liberal Democrat type people in the West, people who believe in liberal democracy, which we all do, we have assumed that the Chinese model, which is autocratic, would be subscale, that they would not be able to cross this transition of capability, that they would not be able to essentially build a great country of great researchers and fantastic companies. That was our prejudice. We thought that they would be caught in the middle income trap. Because this round of technology benefits from centralization, think of it as lots of data, lots of powerful computers, there's lots of reasons to think that the technologies that they are doing or that they will be doing will make a huge difference in terms of their leading. Let's use healthcare as something incredibly important. If you took all of the healthcare data of everybody in a country, which you can do in China, but you cannot do in the West, and you certainly cannot do that in Europe, put it all in one big database, you could get insights about disease and, for example, cancer that you wouldn't see unless you looked at all the data. The current generation of AI is really about looking at patterns. It's very good at looking at a pattern and saying, I've seen this pattern before, right? The other thing that's interesting about AI is that the vision systems are better than humans now. So that's why self-driving cars make sense. It's why the doctor should use a computer to examine you, and the computer should give advice to the doctor, and the doctor should say, based on my judgment and the computer's analysis, this is there. This is called the hybrid model. So the long-winded way of answering this, or hopefully briefly say that the stakes are very high for drug discovery, healthcare, transportation, efficient global businesses, misinformation, the way democracies work, etc. And if Chinese technology wins, it could have a lot of spillover. We point out in the report the issues with Huawei. Huawei did a combination of government funding and stealing and very clever invention on their own part to build a 5G network that's much faster than its competitors. This is causing no end of problems in the West, partly because of the subsidies that Huawei gets and so forth. So all of a sudden we have to deal with a Chinese communication system, which everyone believes can be used to further the national security interests of China. That's not a good situation. So the long and short of it is that it's crucial that the West lead in this and lead with Western values. Imagine, for example, if the dominant technologies were all Chinese and they were based on surveillance, which the Chinese are unusually good at and very much world leading at it. How would you feel as a European or as an American if all of these systems were spying on you all the time? Well, aside from the fact that it's illegal, you would be very uncomfortable.
Eric Schmidt, you just mentioned international cooperation. Anders Rasmussen, I know that this is also an issue for you, and you have launched a charter for the Alliance of Democracies here, which mentions technology. Tell us, Anders, what you would specifically like this to do.
Yeah. First of all, let me thank you, Eric Schmidt, for leading the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence. I appreciate very much the report. I can recommend the report to everybody who wants to improve their knowledge of this very important area. So what I suggest is to create an alliance of democracies to counter the advancing autocracies. And an important part of that alliance of democracies is a technological alliance of democracies. And I think such a technological alliance of democracies should have three elements in it. Firstly, a political element where we develop international norms on uses of new technology. It should have a financial element in it to help promote technology that is compatible with our norms and standards in free societies. And thirdly, it should also have a technical assistance element in it. Just the first element of policy, I think, should also encompass exchange of best practices around openness, privacy, security, and data governance. We could also develop export guidelines to promote human rights. And all in all, I think the aim should be to promote freedom, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law in joint efforts to counter censorship, malign information, human trafficking, etc.
Anders, let me ask you, what would the backbone of this be? What would it look like? Are we talking about NATO? Are we talking about the G7? Or are you envisioning something else?
Well, I'm envisioning something else, but of course, NATO is a very important part of this. NATO should step up its effort to, for instance, when it comes to artificial intelligence. I think there are severe security aspects of that. We can foresee as one of the next steps in this development the production of killer robots that will actually give us new aspects of warfare that is destabilizing, in my opinion. So I think NATO should really move forward on this. G7 could also be an instrument, but I think we should go beyond G7 and NATO. We should include important democracies across the globe, including Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, India, just to mention some nations.
By the way, Jeannie,
Eric Schmidt,
Anders,
you heard Anders lay out his goals for such an alliance. What would you like to see an alliance accomplish? Do your goals mesh with Anders?
Well, he actually said it better than I do. So we're in complete agreement. In fact, our report names this the Emerging Technology Coalition, and it's exactly as Anders proposed. And we propose that that coalition of countries launch something called the International Digital Democracy Initiative, which is precisely as he described it. And I think that for the audience that's watching this, if you're not in this, you won't understand how central this is to the future of national security. So an example would be, we're going to have a lot of problems with misinformation. How do we deal with that? We're going to have an awful lot of problems with cyber war, cyber problems of one kind or another. How do we have the same problems? And there's every reason to think that 10 or 12 countries, which are the ones that he named, together could really move this forward. Furthermore, the countries that he's describing together are of a similar size to the opponent, if you will, in terms of reach, competency, etc.
I'm wondering if I could just throw a little resistance back at you and say governments move slowly, very slowly, and sometimes cooperation is slow to build. Eric Schmidt, is time of the essence here? Do we have to get
Yes.
moving on this and moving on it now?
Yes, in fact, we're so worried about this that we have organized a emerging technology summit on July 13th in Washington, D.C. We hope by then the various foolish rules that exist that prevent travel from the U.S. from Europe to the U.S. will be removed. We hope that you all can attend in person. Obviously, if you can't, we'll want you to attend by Zoom. So the important thing here is we've got to get going on this. It's not every month matters. And I agree with you about democracies. Governments moving very slowly. The Chinese government is not moving slowly. They know exactly what they're doing. They're very intelligent and they need to be taken very seriously. I'll give you another example, which I didn't mention before, which is the question of hardware. So it turns out that all of the interesting chips that everybody uses, the really powerful ones, are built in South Korea and in Taiwan. And China has been trying for 30 years to catch up with its neighbor, Taiwan. We, the US, got largely out of this business over the last 15 years because the Asian countries were so good at it. This is a national security issue, right? And so we have recommendations about that. So we need to take this seriously politically, in software and in hardware.
Anders, you've been Secretary General of NATO, and I wish you'd put that hat on for just a moment here. In conversations that I've had with people involved in the technology side of NATO, they said there's sometimes a reluctance to share, that countries don't necessarily want to show others what they're developing. Is this potentially an obstacle when it comes to creating a broader movement to address AI?
Yes, indeed. It is a major obstacle. So I think to develop common global norms and standards among the world's democracies for data sharing, that is essential. Let me just add to what we just discussed. You're quite right. Governments move slowly, and they also do that within NATO. It works too slowly, in my opinion. But I think what we could do is to promote alternatives to technology that autocrats are using for illiberal ends and that can be a threat to our security. We should maximize the impact of government assistance and catalyze private sector investments. I don't think this is a task for governments alone. I would very much like to see private investments as well. So that way, I think we could move faster. And I fully agree with the Schmidt. Time is of the essence here.
Eric Schmidt, talk to me a little bit about the role of private industry and how closely it can or will cooperate with government in this field.
Well, most of the leading work is now being done in private firms. This is unusual because 20 or 30 years ago, the government was the leading thing. This technology is so powerful that businesses are deploying it globally. So you will see much closer relationships between the private sector, tech companies, and so forth, and the U.S. government, partly out of patriotism, partly because there's a lot of money involved. I'd also like to say that I think that Europe is doing things pretty much the wrong way right now. That the first news out of Europe is regulatory. And while there's certainly a space for regulation, the most important thing for Europe to do is to do an analysis of its weaknesses relative to this Chinese threat and American leadership and get its act together, specifically with more funding, more companies, more European investment in these areas, or Europe will then be essentially permanently behind because the two big giants will be competing and Europe will be left behind. And I don't want that.
Anders, you want to respond to that?
Indeed, yes, because I couldn't agree more. And it is a mistake when the Europeans think that they can mediate in a dispute between the United States and China. we should, of course, side with the United States. Otherwise, the free world will lose the race for new technology. So I couldn't agree more. Actually, I suggested when I participated in a meeting in your National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence, I suggested that NATO should create a similar, then it's not National Security Intelligence or National Security Commission, but a NATO Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence. And I think the United States should take the leadership on that.
Eric Schmidt, I'm wondering if one of the important things that has to take place in any alliance, should it be formed, is coordination, a setting of priorities, ensuring that countries are in alignment in terms of what they're developing and that they are, in fact, the technologies that are needed.
I agree with that. So part of this Emerging Technology Council, which the Prime Minister and I have separately and jointly proposed, would do precisely that. I want to remind you that in technology, the governments are not in the lead. The private sector and universities are in the lead. And so if the European response is a government response without a business and academic response, Europe will have no impact whatsoever. And so whether it's a response at Brussels level or whether it's at a country level, each country or Europe itself needs an AI strategy. And that strategy has to include an understanding of where the technology is going, why it's important to the industries of that country, and why it's important to the national security of that country, and who their natural allies are. I believe the natural allies are the United States and the Asian countries to Europe. I agree with the Prime Minister. We need to get these things much closer together. But that kind of communication will be a waste of time without action on the European side. Europe has complained for years that Europe is behind the United States in tech companies and indeed tries to regulate them, which is not, I'm not commenting on. Europe could lead in AI, right? I'll give you an example. A company called DeepMind, which is headquartered in London, is one of the great inventors of a new area of AI. This was done and Britain was part of Europe at the time. When I was at Google, I spent an awful lot of time in Zurich and our AI groups there. The talent is in Europe. The problem is the political will and the structure to lead is not there, and it needs to get addressed quickly, in my view.
Anders, you alluded to earlier to the fact that to some degree, maybe we need to cooperate with China because otherwise we risk having sort of a divided world with two different tech standards. Why is that a critical issue?
Well, if we continue down the road as we have embarked upon now, I think there's a clear risk that we will have a divided world. And let me stress, I'm not anti-Chinese. Actually, as Prime Minister of Denmark, I signed a strategic partnership agreement between Denmark and China. I think we need cooperation with China. However, China has turned into a nationalistic and very aggressive nation during recent years, and we have to respond to that. We cannot take that lightly. And I think the only language that is respected in Beijing is a language of power. And that's why we need an alliance of democracies. Together, the world's democracies represent 60% of the world economy. And we have at our disposal really strong technological knowledge. We should mobilize our economic power and our technological power and use it to the benefit of freedom and democracy.
Eric Schmidt, I had a conversation with another member of your commission last week, Gilman Louie, who said to me, there's no second place in artificial intelligence. Could you expand on that for us?
So, and Gilman, of course, is a fantastic technology and a member of our commission. In technology, there tends to be one winner. And the reason is that there's multiple choices, and then one technology does something better, and then it gets more data, more resources, more partners, and so forth. This is called a network effect. And there's every reason to believe that AI will follow the same path, that the country or countries that are aligned, that invest heavily now, have a better chance of being that first place finisher. That doesn't mean there won't be a second place, but the first place finisher will drive the technology, drive the research, drive the policies, and so forth. It's been true in technology for my whole life, and I have every reason to believe that it will remain to be true for the next 20 or 30 years.
Eric Schmidt, thank you so much for joining us once again, Chairman of the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence. And Anders, I am now going to turn things over to you. We've come to the end of the Copenhagen Democracy Summit, and I would love to hear you sum it up.
Thank you very much, Dean. Thank you for your moderation of moderating our discussion. And as we conclude the final day of the Copenhagen Democracy Summit, I would like to thank you all for joining us virtually. And I would also like to thank those who came to the Royal Playhouse yesterday. We hope that next year we can host you all physically as we continue to defend democracy together. And I would now like to thank those who helped make this come to life. Thank you to our moderators, Dean Meserve and Ryan Heath, and team of staff and volunteers who joined us. I would also like to thank our wonderful partners who help support us in not just the summit, but throughout the year to make this conference a success. Thank you. Thank you all again. And we look forward to engaging with you at the next Copenhagen Democracy Summit.